So welcome everybody. My name is Rabbi Mark Katz, and we are so proud and privileged to be able to put on tonight's event. It's fortuitous. We wanted to host this event no matter what, but it's actually fortuitous that this event is happening basically within the week of Transgender Day of Visibility, which was March 31st. And so tonight, I hope that that we get a new look at the way that we can look at Jewish texts, because I personally read Joy's book, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 months ago with a few congregants. And I finished the book and I was profoundly moved by the book, by the way that Joy talked about God, by the way that Joy talked about community, and by the way that Joy talked about our biblical ancestors. And so immediately we got in contact with Joy and we said, look, this learning, this knowledge needs to be shared with as many people in our community as possible. We're always looking for new lenses to look at the Torah. And Joy's lens is this profoundly, for me, unique lens that I think every single one of us needs to use as we're looking at our sacred texts. And so we are privileged to have her. We're also privileged to have Seth Marnin with us. And I'm going to read both of their bios, and then really I'm going to kind of get out of the way and give them a chance to have a conversation together. So you can meet them and find out who they are and find out about the really kind of creative theological work that Joy did in her book. And then there will be plenty of time to ask questions toward the end. Again, make sure you put your questions into the chat if you want to ask them. So I first want to introduce you to Seth Martin. So Seth is the Director of Training and Education for the Office of Equal Opportunity and Affirmative Action at Columbia University. He leads Columbia's harassment and discrimination prevention efforts. Seth is a longtime leader and an advocate in higher education and the law. He began his career in student affairs and residential life at the University of Alabama. He later joined the University of Connecticut as the Director of Gay and Lesbian, Bisexual, and Transgender Resources. He moved from higher education to practicing employment law, and then he subsequently served as the Vice President for Civil Rights at the Anti-Defamation League, where he oversaw ADL's domestic civil rights agenda. Before joining Columbia University, Seth founded Workplace Strategies, a consulting firm advising nonprofits on a range of legal issues related to non-discrimination, sexual harassment, and equal opportunity, and affirmative action. Seth is a speaker nationally and internationally on LGBTQ issues, hate crime laws, discrimination, civil rights, religious liberty, and a host of other issues. And he also is, and this is the way that we were connected, and I want to thank Joan Gary and Eileen Opatat, who connected us to him as our facilitator for tonight. He's the chair of Keshet's board of directors, and he previously served on the planning committee for the National LGBT Bar Association's Transgender Roundtable. And so he's connected not only to the LGBTQ community secularly, but also a real leader in efforts of equality within the Jewish community. So we're privileged to have him. And our featured speaker tonight, who Seth is going to be in conversation with, is Joy Ladin, the Gottesman Chair in English at Yeshiva University. She is the first and still only openly transgender employee of an Orthodox Jewish institution, and has published 9 books of poetry, including the Book of Anna, just published in a revised second edition, a memoir of gender transition, National Jewish Book Award finalist, Through the Door of Life, and Landa Literary and Triangle Award finalist, and this is the book that I read and that is the catalyst for tonight's discussion, The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective. Episodes of her online conversation series, Containing Multitudes, are available at jewishlive.org/multitudes, and her writing is available on her website, joyladin.wordpress.com. And I also want to invite people, if you feel comfortable, in light of the fact that we are trying to bring awareness to a practice that I think is a really important practice to do in general. It's what it means to be an open and embracing community. If you feel comfortable to put your pronouns in your name, that way we model for everybody what it means to be a community where we don't make any assumptions about one another. And so with that, I want to turn things over to Seth and to Joy.
Thank you so much. It's a total treat to be here with you this evening. And it's always a treat to be in conversation with Joy Ladin, and particularly about The Soul of the Stranger. I had the opportunity to be at the launch of the book and hear Joy speak then, and snatched the book right away. And it's always I love being able to return to a text like this, and think about it a little bit differently as I thought about the kinds of questions that I wanted to speak with Joy about tonight. And I kind of want to start at the beginning with the way that you define transgender in the book, and particularly the way that you use it throughout. It's far more expansive, almost a universal identity than what we typically think about when we think about trans people. And I'm wondering, I kind of want to start there with you and your thinking about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say it just keeps getting broader for me. And maybe if the book has a hidden agenda, it's that by the time you end up reading it, you should realize that any identity with gender at all means that you're trans, because you'll never fit into it. But I backed into this idea. So when I started working on the book, I thought I had a sabbatical. I thought this will be easy. What have I been doing for the past 10 years? I've been talking about Torah. I transgender all my life. A couple of months, we'll have a book done there. And then I sat down to work on it. And I thought, oh, well, the first thing to do is to figure out what's a transgender perspective. Because I told the, you know, people who gave me the grant, that's what I was going to be doing. And then I realized, okay, that's a problem. Because it's not that I didn't have definitions of transgender, but I hadn't thought about what was the perspective, what was the aspect of being transgender that affected the way I read Torah. It was a question that I was asked when I returned to my job after transition. I met with a small group of students, and one of them said, "So how has this affected how you read the Torah?" And I was like, "Oh, that's such a Stern College question. That's adorable." And inside I was also thinking, "Oh, darn, I don't know. I've been kind of caught up with other stuff, but I ought to figure that out." So now it was really time to figure that out. And the first step for me was to distinguish between my particular kind of trans identity, which is transsexual, a medical term developed for people who are born into and socialized into one gender, but identify with the other gender and end up um, living as that other gender because of how strongly they identify. So, and I thought, well, was that really the thing that affected how I read Torah? Because I knew that the way I read Torah was powerfully affected by this, but it didn't seem to have anything to do with my identification as female. So I was confused. I was also confused because at that point I had done many, probably dozens of talks to college age or young, relatively young people, audiences where they already considered me a relic of a previous era. And in fact, it was a couple of years after I started living as myself, somebody said, "So, how does it feel as one of our elders? Can you tell us about it?" I'm like, "Wait a second, I've been doing this for 2 years. You're putting me in a museum already." So, but I was forcibly made aware of the fact that there are a lot of different relations to gender other than the one that I knew. And the other ones were as mysterious to me as I felt I was to most non-trans people. So the first question was, is the perspective I'm reading Torah that I'm talking about, is it rooted in transsexual experience of being born onto this side of the binary, but identifying on this side of the binary and going from one side to the other? Or is it something that speaks more broadly to trans ideas? And I realized it was the latter, because the way that my trans gender perspective mostly affected my reading of the Torah at first was it really zeroed me in on the character of God. And there was nothing about God that had anything to do with my identification as a female. It wasn't that. It was rather the inability to fit into gender categories. And when I started reading the Torah as a kid, of course, I didn't have anything like this language, but I was attracted to God as another character who doesn't fit into human categories. And so that was the way I kind of backed into this definition of transgender as anybody who identifies as anything more complicated than simply male or female. And some part of me must have already realized that I'd never met anybody who didn't identify as anything more complicated than simply male or female. I'd never met anybody who just said, "Hi, I'm male. That's all you need to know about me. That's the only way I identify." You know, if you
Yep.
want to know who I am, just look up male in the dictionary. That's me. Nothing more, nothing less. Right? People aren't like that. But I wasn't consciously thinking about that. I was just thinking, yeah, it's this not fitting into categories. And if I build it at this broadly, I don't have to get hung up on terminology, and I can look for the common denominator of my experience that might hopefully people, other kinds of trans people or non-binary people can sign on to that experience, because I think what we all have in common is the sense of not fitting into gender as it's been traditionally constructed. And that way I don't have to try to name everybody and get that stuff right.
Yeah. No, and as I was reading it, and as I'm, watching these bills around the country being introduced, right, whether they're around excluding trans kids from sports or denying healthcare to trans kids, right, that if we can embrace a broader understanding of what it means to be trans, is there a shared identity or an understanding, a greater understanding that we can get from it. I'm curious to know, when you were writing, right, when you started this book in earnest, as it were, uh, who were you imagining as your audience? Who were you writing to?
Oh God. Well, that was a mess. Um, so I was imagining, on the one hand, the that there's an academic trans tradition of trans studies. I mean, it's a little young to call it a tradition, but really it is. And it goes back to maybe Sandy Stone, um, who wrote a very influential rant about the Empire Strikes Back against Janice Raymond's The Transsexual Empire. And Sandy is brilliant and very strange, but was inspired, as she was a grad student, and she was inspired by post-structuralist theory. And thus began a very strange marriage of post-structuralist theory, which is jargon laden and endlessly referential. You can't do post-structuralist theory without referring to many, many lines of complicated critical conversation, each of which with their own jargon. So academic trans studies tends to be unintelligible to people who don't have PhDs. And I have a PhD, and a lot of it is unintelligible to me. But of course, I had to write to those people, right? I had gotten a grant from the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, who were looking for something with a feminist slant. They wouldn't have a PhD in trans studies, so that was another audience that I had, learned but not learned in that way. I did hope that I wouldn't embarrass myself to people, all their people who'd read the Torah. So that was another audience that I had in mind. And I also was thinking of the folks that most of my work as a trans person who tries to speak on trans issues, most of the work I've done isn't with trans people. It's mostly with non-trans people. And so I was hoping to write things that would appeal to those people, because in a way, the inspiration for the book came from seeing that when I talked about the Torah and God in my talks about trans experience, people were interested in a way that I found bizarre. I didn't think anybody would be interested in that, but people really were. So, so the book was a mess, because every sentence I was trying to write to these completely different kinds of audiences. And if you're a writing teacher, teaching writers to clearly imagine who they're writing to, that's a major skill, because who you're writing to determines the vocabulary you use, the complexity of your sentences, all kinds of things. And I had at least 4 in mind. And I completed a draft of most of the book and gave it to Rabbi Bert Vysotsky at JTS. And Bert is a great writer. And he read it and he said, I really like the ideas in here, but the writing is terrible. And if you're a poet, to have your writing criticized by a rabbi, of all things, even a rabbi who's a good writer like Bert, I don't know, it was one of the low points of my career as a writer, I have to say, and no offense, Rabbi, but I'd always had this smug sense of superiority as a writer when it came to rabbis. And the thing that was upsetting was he was totally right. He said, it's just not well written enough. And then he said something that was really transformative. He said, you should write this in a way that it speaks to the widest possible range of audiences. And that meant, well, that was scary. That meant that I had to stop doing the things that would defend me from critiques by the post-structuralist trans studies people, or the feminist theory people, or the political activist people. I just had to take away all of the cover your rear end kind of rhetoric and write what I meant as vulnerably as possible. And that's the way that it felt. I expected people to just laugh at it in a certain way, because learning to write as an academic is learning to show off in ways that intimidate people and also equivocate, so nobody can tell exactly what you're claiming, and thus nobody can debunk you. And I stripped all that away and I realized, this stuff really matters to me. These are some of the deepest truths that that have sustained me through my life, and I need to write it as though I'm whispering to somebody that I feel very close to.
So beautiful. Thank you. At the beginning of your comments, you talked about the strange marriage. And I think surely because of preparing to be here tonight and reading the book, again, over the last week or so. In this week's Parsha, right, Shmini, we have the story of Aaron's 2 sons, Nadav and Avihu, sneaking into the Mishkan and offering the Eish Zara, right, the strange fire. And it wasn't until thinking about that and reading Soul of the Stranger, when you describe your relationship to Judaism as strange. And I started wondering about the connection between strange and stranger. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about the connection between those, or you're thinking about that.
Okay, I just have to pause and say these are the best questions I've ever gotten in anything like this. This is so cool. I also need to ask you if you know the Talking Heads song "Burning Down the House."
Of course.
The line "strange but not a stranger" really echoed in my head as I was working on the book once I had that title. But all right, to geek out about the Parsha of the week for a second, it breaks my heart to read that story. And when I was a kid, I remember being really confused by how could it be bad to want to get close to God? Why would that be a death penalty kind of offense? What sense did that make? And then if you read some of the commentaries, some of them say actually the Mishkan was the human sacrifice that was necessary to complete the sanctification process of it. And, the ambiguity of God, being sanctified by this whole process of events, both by saying, no, don't ever do this again, but also maybe by this kind of loss. And certainly by, the birth of Jewish professionalism is Aaron having to continue to function as high priest, even after 2 of his sons have just been killed by the God that he's serving. So they offer this strange fire, which on the one hand is a complete violation, and on the other hand is perhaps essential to complete the sanctification process. The idea of human sacrifice completely outside the bounds of the religion that is being structured in this parsha. But in some weird way, they are both outside and inside what this is. And they certainly seem to be drawing. I mean, I'm guessing that this wasn't like a college prank. Like, hey, Nadav, yeah, want to get smashed and offer strange fire on on the altar? It's like, no, right? They were drawn to the God that they were serving. And that was in an excess of desire for closeness. So I do feel that it's one of the places in the Torah, though I hadn't thought of it till you just asked the question, where so much of the Torah is about drawing bounds, and so much of halacha is about distinguishing what is right and what's not right, who's in and who's out, what's okay and what's not okay. But I think that in a lot of places you see boundaries being crossed. And Pesach, of course, is the holiday that reminds us of the arbitrariness of these boundaries and these binaries. Because chametz really functionally only exists for 1 week a year. Otherwise, there's just food. And then during Pesach, there's chametz and there's the stuff that you can eat. And like, right? It's crazy. Nobody says, if we're really serious about Passover, we should get rid of all chametz all the time. Then we'd really be holy. No, it's like we have to be, and it's like the tabernacle itself. It gets set up, and then that space is the Holy of Holies, and then it gets dismantled and packed and carried through the wilderness until it gets set up again. So there's a way in which the tradition is also, I think, teaching us about the constructedness of these categories that we use to understand ourselves, holiness.
The phrase constructedness of categories, in the beginning of the book, you write about religious communities being able to include openly trans people without abandoning or betraying the traditions. And as I read that, it makes it a choice, right? It makes it a choice about whether to include or exclude, or perhaps more aptly, to make strangers of trans people, right? It's a constructed thing. And the way you expose that in both such a lovely and horrifying way, right? That it is a choice, that that a community can do that. I want to unless you want to
add a little addendum to that. That's because there's actually, and I know you know this because you've done so much of this work, there's a whole range of choices that communities make. And I don't discuss this in the book, but very few communities choose to really fully include trans people. I mean, there are all kinds of human beings. There are so many different ways to be human. And most communities are ill-equipped to fully include very many of those ways of being human. We hope Jewish communities are equipped to include Jews, but after that, things get dicey. But so there are many communities that tolerate trans people, right? You can be there, you can be trans, but don't expect any programming. Don't expect us to ever use the word trans. Don't expect us to ask you about this, or if we do, it'll be because we're having trans night at the synagogue, kind of thing, right? And there are welcoming synagogues that say, you know what, we really need to get some diversity in here. Let's welcome people that we see as strange or as different, right? I think that that's an important step. All of these are choices, and I don't think human beings ever do anything perfectly. So I don't even know if it's possible to create an all-inclusive community. But if there were one, I think it would work like the old definition of God, as God is the being whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. To me, that's the ideal of a community.
That's beautiful. So I've talked, you will be surely unsurprised to hear that I have talked often with our friend Rabbi Mike Moskowitz about where gender lies, right? Like how do you find gender? And for the record, I don't have an answer to that exactly.
Do you
but
mean
I
where
was
did it grow out of? Like what exactly?
kind of like, how do you know? Like how do you find it? And so when you were writing about God didn't seem to have a where. And it's right. And it's sort of, there's this sort of connection, right, between God and gender in sort of an unidentifiable location. And I'm wondering if you could talk about sort of locating gender and locating God in that way.
I am not, this is very profound and I'm not positive I'm understanding it. So correct me if I'm responding to the wrong question, okay? One of the things that is really weird and I think exhausting and ultimately maybe a little boring about being trans or non-binary is trying to locate that sense of gender. And the reason that you get stuck in it, I've come to, this is just my own theory. It's not supported by anything. It's just made this stuff up. But I think that the way human beings develop a sense of who we are is that we introject the materials that our cultures give us and our families give us to identify who we are. So being a Jew, that was easy, right? My family told me I was Jewish. We had a Jewish community that helped fill in the blanks of what that meant. It resonated for me. I didn't resist it. Some people do. Some people are like, ew, no, I don't relate to this at all, but I didn't. It worked for me. So there was a combination of the categories that the culture sets up for identifying yourself and my own internal preferences, my sense of who I was, what was important about me, what resonated for me, and whether you want to do the stuff that expressing an identity means. So there are people, I would think my father probably fell into this category, people who are like, yeah, I'm Jewish, and guess what? I don't want to do any Jewish things. I'm done. I don't reject the identity, but I don't want to, I'm not interested in doing any of the Jewishy things. I feel that way about Ashkenazic foods. It's like, I'm Jewish, I'm Ashkenazic, please don't offer me gefilte fish. So these are these different things. So I identify myself as Jewish, other people see me as Jewish, and there are Jewish things that I like to do. So I have a functional Jewish identity. When it came to gender, people told me who they saw me as, and there were things that they told me what to do. If you're a guy, these are the things you're supposed to do, but I didn't resonate with them or relate to them. I just met somebody who said that they don't have a sense of gender at all. I mean, they live as a woman, and that's okay, but internally they describe it as a kind of color blindness. They don't know where gender lies. It just doesn't make any sense to them, but it clearly means a lot to other people. So it's something you can learn to do the way people who can't perceive color probably figure out how to cross the street safely and things like that, right? So that's my theory of how we sort out identity. And when you identify in a way, when you have a sense of yourself that the culture doesn't help you name, or that the culture gives you horrible names for, right? So gay men, many cultures offer horrible ideas to gay males about who they are and what they are. So they can say, oh, wow, if I feel this way and I want that, I guess that means I'm this, but this is awful. White American culture gives that kind of crap to people of color in America. Yeah, we'll tell you who you are. really not very pleasant. But with trans people and non-binary people, the gender stuff that you're given by your culture doesn't work. So you have this sense, if you're not agender, like this person I was just talking about, you have this sense that you should be able to figure this out, right? In my case, I felt like my culture did give me material that resonated with me, and but that was the female stuff that was not supposed to be mine, so that created the problem. But there are so many different ways that people can relate to gender, and the options that our culture offers seem relatively crude when you say binary male or female. Within male and female, actually, there's quite a wide spectrum. And one of the cool things, I'm sorry, I'm getting off track, but one of the cool things about teaching at Stern, and Mike would know this also, although I'm not sure he's thought of it this way, is when you have homosocial societies, so sex segregated societies, each, the male parts and the female parts, all of the roles are just played by men in the male side and women in the women's side, which means that as long as men and women are interacting with each other, there's an incredibly broad understanding of what women can do and women can be, because all the leadership roles are occupied by women on the women's side, and the same thing on the male side, right? Anybody who's going to be doing caretaking, nurturing, whatever, in the male community is going to have to be a guy by definition. It's when you get to the borderline that people start getting anxious about sorting out who's who. And when we get anxious, we reach for binary thinking. And then we start really radically oversimplifying humanity. But that's why I think that there are a lot of people can identify with trans experience who are not trans. They can make do with this mess of stuff of maleness and femaleness. They may not like it very much, but they can make do with it. But we all have experiences of parts of ourselves that don't fit in, or times when we're uncomfortable with what our culture has given us.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting. To the extent that I had any ideas about this, it made me think about right and left-handedness, right? Like, right? I mean, right? It's sort of, you're right-handed, left-handed, or ambidextrous, but nobody, there's no there. Right? You just, that was the best that I could.
No, that's really good, because a lot of left-handed people have gotten really messed up by people insisting that they live as right-handed people.
Mm-hmm. Right, and we've really evolved on that.
I see. Hands are going up.
You see? And we've really evolved on that too, right? I mean, my great-grandmother of blessed memory would tell stories. As a child, she was forced to write with her right hand. And so she wrote with her right hand, but did everything else with her left hand, including crocheting. So teaching me to crochet was a disaster because it was the wrong way. So I've often thought about being trans as a gift, right? Not everyone gets to experience the world from such a unique vantage point, particularly around privileges lost and gained, right, of living as a man or a woman in this society. And I was talking about that recently, the sort of unearned privileges that I get, and that I get to be an authority on things that I don't know anything about. Nobody interrupts me. I, can share an idea at a meeting and it gets paid attention to. It's remarkable. Yeah, right. And particularly having been, right, and on the other side of it, right, where I was talked over, or where I was, I would share an idea and nothing happened. And then a few minutes later, a man in the room would say, "Oh, that's a fantastic idea." And you sit there saying, "What?" And so in reading Soul the Stranger, I started thinking about those experiences of how transitioning has made me either more or less of a stranger in different places, right? And particularly in religious spaces, right? I when I first moved to New York City, and it was near the high holidays and I didn't belong to a shul, there was an Orthodox shul around the corner from where I was living. And I went in and was in the men's section. And I was there on time. And so I was asked to open the ark. And then later on, I was asked to take it, right? And the women were sitting behind the curtain. And right. And so I got this sort of privilege in this space, right? And then there are other spaces that I am not in, or I do a lot of work in the introduction around sexual harassment, and people sort of, when I talk about it, sort of like, well, how do you know anything about sexual harassment? Right. And so I guess I was hoping that you could talk about your experiences of feeling more or less like a stranger in transitioning.
Mm. I'm thinking about this partly because, as the book repeats, I think over and over again, probably, I always grew up with a sense of being a stranger to this human world. And of course, I also grew up with all of the unearned privileges. I would say the opposite. I mean, my family was problematic for me in a lot of different ways, but it was definitely better to be a boy in that family than it was to be my sister. And I was not at all aware of the ways in which I was abusing those dynamics. And it was so bound up for me with my own sense of bitterness and exclusion from what I wanted that I think that made it harder. But as I've come to learn about reflecting on my position as a white person, I realized, no, I don't like being aware of my unearned privilege. I will take any excuse to just feel like meritocracy, good stuff that comes to me, I deserve it all, and repel any other kind of awareness. When I got involved with my now ex-wife, we were at Sarah Lawrence College. We were freshmen, and she was, I think, still going to a lesbian separatist study group. Not that she was a lesbian separatist, but she identified as a radical feminist. And she very forcefully confronted me with the fact that, I was just utterly normal as far as being a man in a relationship with a woman, and what I expected and took for granted and didn't even bother to notice I was expecting. For example, leaving my clothes on the floor wherever. Not only did I do that, but I couldn't see them. It was like I had an astigmatism or something, or maybe I'd been hypnotized. So, and she would say, you leave your clothes on the floor. And I'd say, no, I don't. And she'd say, look down. And I'd say, what? That's the floor. And she's like, no, that's a pile of your clothes. So I was mortally offended because I felt like, well, no, I've always identified as female. So there's no possible way that this could be true. But of course, it was true. I didn't like being male. If somebody had, given me the choice to instantaneously trade all of those privileges for the chance to actually grow up as a girl and into a woman, I would have taken it. But that didn't stop me from being socialized as a male in all of the worst ways, I would say. And when I was starting to realizing that I was going to not be able to live as a man, and my then wife and I were talking about it, she continued to be very articulate and clear and honest about this, and really helped me understand why there are women who wouldn't see me as a woman. And in fact, I stopped claiming that. I said, I talk about living as a woman. I do say I've always identified as female. She helped me realize that I don't know what that means. That's where does gender lie? She said, like, what does it mean to identify as female? She said, I'm female, and I don't know what it means to identify as female. I went, oh gosh, I guess I don't really know. And I don't know if what I mean by that is what is shared with anybody else. How the heck could I know? So that was a pretty crucial part of my education. And I think it also fed into that broad definition of transgender that I ended up with in the book, because I didn't want to be trans. I didn't consider it a blessing or a gift, which I think, what isn't a blessing or a gift? But I really just wanted to be female. And it was very reluctantly realizing that I identify within the gender binary. I can use those cultural materials to make sense of myself, but I really don't fit binary gender definitions of male or female. So I'm a non-binary person with a binary gender identification is what I've come down to.
I'm not going to ask you if you still throw your clothes on the floor. You don't have to answer.
I'm not seeing any right now. That's all I'll say.
I want to shift a bit. After the 2016 election and over the past few years, I know that you've spent time traveling before COVID and visiting communities around the country. And I was hoping that you could speak to that experience and particularly, and these are my words, I'm not, you can say this isn't the case, but as I've imagined it, talking to strangers, particularly the experience of seeing difference as a, right. So you're talking to people who maybe voted differently, who, right, this is after the 2016 election, connecting with folks who were strangers. And when I've heard you talk about it, not to, put too much anything on it, I've been struck by the ways in which seeing difference or differences as a basis of commonality and relationship, and particularly, right, in this period of time that has been so fraught. And I was hoping that you could share some of your experiences and what you learned and what it was like.
Thank you. After the 2016 election, I started doing outreach to conservative parts of the country. And of course, I live a few miles from conservative parts of the country now in Western Massachusetts. The red and blue map is complete nonsense. It's even worse than the gender binary as a descriptor of human reality. But I did. I sent letters out to conservative religious leaders, evangelical Christians. Was always my fantasy to be invited to speak at a church full of people who hate trans people. For some reason, and ideally they would hate Jews also. I don't know why, but that was what I was after, and I've not achieved it. Perhaps not surprisingly, although I did offer to pay all my own expenses, nobody who really hates trans people wanted me to come to their church or community. Figure. But I did manage to go to a bunch of parts of the country that were outside my blue East Coast bubble. Alabama a little bit, and Georgia, and northern Wisconsin. And what I would say is, so in the soul of the stranger, as I was writing that book, as I was working through that, and my definition of transgender kept getting broader and broader until it ended up including anybody who's ever felt like they don't fit into the categories that their culture has given them, which is pretty much anybody who has been conscious in a certain way. There was a rabbi, who I don't remember the name, unfortunately, who said, whoever doesn't feel they're in exile isn't really awake. And I think that speaks to that. So as I was developing that sense, that experience, when I would talking to audiences in these conservative areas, most of the people who came, not all of them, but most of the people who came were not super politically different than I was. sort of centrist to progressive. Um, and they were all, even the most conservative, there were some very conservative people, but they were all people who were curious about other ways of being human. And so I don't know that I've ever had the real rubber meets the road test of these ideas that I have. But the people that I talked with, I found that I could usually find a sense of commonality with people in the experience of difference. It wasn't my idea. It was something that was the people, when I would do these talks, people would tell me, sometimes in the Q&A, sometimes afterward, they'd say, I'm not trans, but I've always felt, or I had this kind of problem. I had, a couple come up to me, an elderly couple, and they said, we're not trans, but we don't know anything about this, but we felt really close to you because we lost a child decades ago, and our grief made us feel like we were separate from, everybody else is saying, you have to get over it, you have to move on, and can't do that. So we can't fit in with the other parents because we don't have a child anymore. We can't fit in with the people who aren't actively being parents because we're still caught up in being parents, but for a child who isn't there. And um, so I have felt that there is a way of that being different, the sense of being different, is a deep experience that all human beings have in common. And it's an experience that is bound up with vulnerability and loneliness and a sense of aloneness, which are two different things. But with vulnerability, loneliness, and a sense of aloneness in the world, I think that those are the roots of identity. I think the reason we have identity, which don't fit any of us, right? None of us perfectly fit the identities that we use to operate in the world. So why do that? It's like everybody in the world wears clothes that don't fit. What is wrong with this species? Except it's worse than clothes that don't fit, right? These are things that don't fit your psyche. Why do we do this? And I think it is because of this deep rooted sense of vulnerability, loneliness, and aloneness. And the response to that is to create these identities that are compromises, that enable us to recognize others as being us at the sacrifice of some pieces of us. Nobody's perfectly us, but it's good enough. There are other Jews. I'm with other Jews. Are you all really like me? Are you exactly like me? I doubt it, but I'm not going to ask questions because I want to feel a sense of belonging. I want to feel akin to you. And so I'm not going to look for the places where we're different. And so what I've found is that getting to me, encouraging people to access their own feelings of difference. And, when you do diversity talks, when you're talking about being the different one, the funny thing is that the people who have always fit in often feel kind of envious, right? Like the way there are a lot of white people who seem to be envious of Black people being discriminated against. Well, we have problems too, right? Yeah, absolutely, right. When the attention is being given to people who are different in certain ways or marginalized or oppressed, it's like, hey, wait a second. But I realize, but that's actually true. That's also, some of it is like envy, but some of it is also like, yeah, that's right. We all carry these deep wounds and sense of vulnerability. And the feeling that if people see a little too much of us, we might find ourselves alone in the world. And so that means that where there is a strong sense of identity, where that matters to people, those other feelings of being without identity are also strongly present. And so that is the way that I've tried to develop this sense of commonness. But I have to acknowledge something, which is that in areas where people are less used to thinking about people who are different the way I'm different, um, it's hard to get to that place because that's not really what they're there for. They're really there to learn about people who are different, the way that I'm different. And so before they want to think about what we have in common, they really want to learn about me. And so I have to be the different person, which is I think it's an important role. It's something that has been paid for by Yeshiva University, which probably did not see part of its core mission as being funding greater awareness of trans people and trans Jews. Um, but they not only because they've given me a salary, which has enabled me to do a lot of these gigs for not very much money, but also because the status of being a professor has meant that it's not so hard for me to be the different person. Whereas I think for a lot of trans people and non-binary people, where you really feel like you're marginalized in your community, that is really hard work to do. But I have all of this social shielding, this unearned privilege, I guess I would say. And so I think that I haven't done that finding the commonality of difference work nearly as much as I fantasized about. But I still think the theory, it sounds right to me.
I tend to agree. I tend to agree. I want to make sure folks, if you have questions, to put them in the chat. And I don't know, I just want to make sure, and when you put them in the chat, to make sure that they go sort of either to me directly, if that is possible, or to the group. And if they go to anybody else, then that person should let us know, because I'm not seeing any questions in the chat yet. But if you have them, please.
And I just want to say, Seth is just delightful to talk with, and I am rambling incoherently. So if you have questions, but they're not related to any of the things that I'm saying, please don't hesitate to ask them. I would really like to say things that are relevant to what you're thinking and not just ramble for my own pleasure.
Ask and ye shall receive. Someone is wondering if you can talk about God in your book as the ultimate other.
Yes, that is really where when I had to go through this process of figuring out what a transgender perspective was, and recognize that at the heart of it was this experience of feeling other, of feeling outside of the categories that human beings use to identify one another. So that would be, I think that they're actually, I've been looking for good definitions of otherness, and there aren't really great definitions of otherness. But my functional definition is that everybody is other, except to the extent that we can use the categories our cultures provide us to be identified as us, to be recognized and recognize other people as people that we have kinship with, that we have something in common with. And so that sense of otherness was, I realized, what was connecting me to God and what I was noticing in the Torah. And as I was working that through the book, I realized that I had, because this was ideas, they weren't ideas, it was just an experience of a child, right? So I'm hanging on to God for dear life. God is the only person I really have, and we're bound by our common otherness. And it wasn't really till I was writing the book that I realized, oh, wait a second, that is also a form of idolatry, right? That's also a human category that I'm projecting onto God, right? Oh, God and me, we're just the same in our otherness. In fact, we're the cool kids because we're the only people who are other the way we're other. And that sort of forced me to recognize that God was actually absolutely other, and that I was no closer to God than anybody else in my otherness. And then by the end of the book, I thought, hey, wait a second, that means that compared to God, trans people are like, we're not even different flavors of humanity. Like compared to God, no human beings are other. We all fit pretty snugly in human categories when you compare God's difficulty of fitting into human categories.
Sorry, now we're getting more questions.
Oh, good. Okay.
Other than God, are there other characters in the Torah that fall under the category of trans?
Well, to the extent that contemporary definitions of transness rely on self-identification, right? So somebody being trans means that they say, I've located gender in myself in a way that is different from the way other people see me, and therefore I'm trans. The Torah, I don't think, cares enough about individual human beings or individual psyches to let us know how anybody identifies. And my extreme example of this, my proof of it in a way, is Abraham. The Torah lavishes a lot of attention on Abraham. We even get glimpses of how Abraham feels and thinks, which is pretty rare for any human being. But it doesn't tell us anything about what Abraham thinks of himself as a father after that little, all fathers make mistakes, but not all fathers try to sacrifice their child on an altar that they've tied them to. So you would think that if anything messed with Abraham's sense of his gender identity, his identity as father, it would be nearly murdering his son. But the Torah doesn't even care enough to tell us whether Abraham feels bad about it or regret or tries to make it up for Isaac or anything. So I don't feel that I have the material to identify anybody in the Torah as transgender. I do think that there are a lot of characters who um, don't fit the roles that they're assigned or who move from one role to another. King David is an expert at this. I don't know if, he seems to be pretty happy about being male, I have to say, and delights in whatever privilege he has. But his career has him somersaulting from one role to another with unbelievable ease. Even at one point, he adopts the role of an insane person to keep himself safe, and he doesn't seem to have any difficulty in doing that. So he would have to have a sense of himself as being independent of a lot of the human categories of identification. But I still, so in that, he's somebody I would point to as having had a lot of trans experiences, but I don't know if he would identify as trans or transgender.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah,
No?
absolutely.
Yeah? Okay. So God said that God could never be seen or you would die. Can you talk about the notion of not being seen as a trans person as it relates to God not allowing, I think, God's self to be seen?
God says specifically, you can't see my face and live, but you can see my back. And I'm really grateful that you didn't ask me what that might mean, because I don't think I know. I have, I guess I would say we know where God has been, but we can't see when God is right in front of us. Something like that is what I would come up with. But it's striking that I think a lot of, not everybody, but growing up the way that I did, maybe the way that you did, I think for transsexuals specifically, that feeling of not being seen, that the gender that you're raised to live in, the gender roles that make you visible as one of us to everybody else, right? So that's the way gender works. I lived as a boy, and that was how my family identified me as one of us, kids on the block and everything. But it made me feel invisible and not seen. And I felt like I didn't have a face that could be seen. So in that episode where God is holding Moses in the cleft of the rock, God doesn't say, I don't have a face, or that nobody can see my face, but you can't see it. Like human beings can't bear to see my face. And I think the closest that I came to that was I did have a sense that the truth about me was really dangerous in my family. When I learned the term nuclear family, I remember thinking, yeah, I'm the nuclear explosion waiting to happen in the middle of this family. I felt like the truth about me was destructive and hurtful to other people. And so I both felt like I was invisible. I literally didn't have a face that could be seen. I didn't feel like I knew what my face looked like. I don't know if other trans people have felt this way, but I remember feeling like a little bewildered whenever I would look in the mirror. And I remember after I started living as myself for years, when I would go to the bathroom, which is, I'm not really a mirror person, but I'd go to the bathroom and I would look in this mirror and be like, oh, thank God I'm still there. Because I had this feeling of erasure all of my life when I would look at myself. But then on the other hand, I felt like, and if anybody did see me, it would be destructive. So God, I feel like, can be visible in a way that I didn't feel like I could be visible, although maybe not to human beings, but that's on us, not so much a limitation of God's. But maybe like God, I felt like that my visibility would be destructive. And I think that's the way that the family that I made with my now ex-wife, that's the way that they felt about it. Um, Not to the extent that I was afraid of as a kid, maybe, but
I'm going to sneak one more question in. Is it too literal to consider that woman came from man, Eve from Adam, and thus the first human was both genders?
the the good root text for that. That's the first time I've heard that story pointed to for that. But there's kind of a mainstream midrash on the first creation of humanity at the end of the first chapter of Genesis. So before the Gan Eden story, that peculiar sentence where it says, God made human beings in God's own image, male and female God created them. And one of the syntax of is a mess in that sentence. And one of the ways to read it is the first human the Adam was male and female. And there's a tradition in Kabbalah of Adam Kadmon, who is both male and female. Um, Sociologically, I was thrilled when I learned that in order to learn how to be one gender, when our kids learn how to be boys or girls, they can't do that unless they learn the rules of the other gender so that they can avoid doing the things that would make them recognizable as the other gender. And when I read that, I'm like, oh wow, this is great. That means that it's tacitly all there in socialization. So I think that that's one of the ways that the gender binary works, is to the extent that one gender defines the other, you can't have a sense of yourself as one gender without also having internalized the sense of the other gender as what you're not. And I'm guessing my agender friend doesn't have those codes, don't make any sense to them, so they don't identify either way. But in the the creation of Eve story, I think what's really profound is that Adam Adam's created out of the earth, and so are the animals that God passes before Adam. But Adam doesn't recognize any of those animals as kin, even though they're all made by the same being out of the same substance. And that's clearly God's idea. Like, you're all the same, you're all lumps of clay. This is claymation, Adam, you know? Oh, this is you're like a robo chicken, and here are other things that I've made out of clay, and you'll find somebody you really like here. And then when that doesn't work, God thinks, oh, right, you need something that is human. You need an other who, the most important thing about this other is that it's you. It's akin to you, is the deep kinship. And that, I think, is the way I read that story, is not so much that human beings are hermaphroditic, but that Adam's first reaction to Eve, who, if you think about it, must have looked pretty weird. If you've only seen your own male body, what the heck are you going to make out of Eve the first time you see Eve? But what Adam says is, oh, you're bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. Adam doesn't see the woman as being different. The first thing he sees is the woman is the way the woman is the same. He sees the woman's humanity. And to me, that is that's what gender ultimately should be. It should be a way of recognizing our humanity. And whenever it gets in the way of that, whenever it makes it harder for us to recognize somebody's humanity, that means there's a defect in our system of gender.
Thank you. Oh, there's.
So thank you both. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Joy. And thank you to all of you who've tuned in. There was actually a question about whether this will be available afterwards. Assuming the recording worked well, we're going to put it up on YouTube, and you can go to Temple Ner Tamid, follow us, and you can see the video. This has been a really great conversation. I learned so much, got so much out of it, and it's because of the vulnerability that you both brought and the insight that you both brought. And so we are better for having heard this past hour's conversation. So thank you. I want to close with a comment in case you didn't see it, because I think it's the perfect way to close. Somebody wrote, I just want to say before we close how much I loved your book, especially as a trans person trying to develop a relationship with Torah as an adult. And one of the passages that has really stuck with me the most is the part in your introduction where you state how because of B'Tselem Elohim, when we expand which means being created in the image of God, when we expand our understanding of humans, we expand our understanding of God. So thank you. And so you have expanded both our understanding of humanity and of God, and we are better for it tonight. And so thank you very much. And for everybody, have a wonderful night. And I'll stop recording now, but I won't necessarily kick you off because I want to give you a chance. If you want to write specifically to Joy or Seth to say thank you, to feel free to do that, or I'll give you permissions to hop off the chat and to say the same thing.